Greetings, gents, and welcome to episode 20 of Econoclasm. I'm sure by now most everyone is aware of the passing of Pope Francis in the early hours of Easter Monday. And I find the timing of his death to be rather poetic. Now, of course, we know God is a magnificent poet. Simply look at the scriptures to understand that. And he always, not necessarily always, but he does like to write poetry with the lives of men. And that certainly seems true with the life of Pope Francis and how he died, when he died. Just a few hours after the celebration of Christ having risen from the grave is when Francis passes. It's like after the celebration of Christ rising, he tells his vicar on earth, "Rest now, I'll hold down the fort for a bit." Now, obviously, I'm not saying that there was the second coming of Christ. It's the celebration of Christ rising and returning to earth from death. And the Pope does serve as the vicar of Christ, as in the person of Christ, as head of the earthly church. I can get into plenty of arguments over that whole thing, but I'm going to try to avoid a lot of arguing or condescension or just combativeness in this episode that is so common throughout every episode. But as far as beliefs of the Catholic Church go, I'm going to just simply operate on that. The Pope is the vicar of Christ. He serves in the person of Christ here on earth, head of the earthly church. Acts in the person of being able to conduct ceremonies, forgiveness of sins, all that. And just hours after the passage of Easter Sunday, I don't know exactly what time the Pope passed. I know I learned about it at about 4 a.m. on Monday. And obviously, Italy is ahead time, so it might have been like 10 a.m. or whatever. I don't know the precise local time, but whatever. Not important. But shortly after celebrating the rise of Christ, the return of Christ to the earth, Pope Francis passes away. God let him have one more Easter, one more celebration of the glorious triumph over death by Christ. And then Christ goes to his vicar and says, "I'm back. Take your leave, Francis." Excuse me. I'll handle things for a bit until the next vicar is chosen. And it would be interesting if it takes 40 days before the next pope is chosen, because that would really line up with the poetry of the moment, since Christ was on earth for 40 days between his resurrection and his ascension into heaven. But we shall see. I saw that estimates for the papal conclave are to start on like the 5th or the 10th. So about 14, 19 days after Pope Francis's death. So then it would have to take like 21 to 26 days of, the cardinals voting, discussing before formally electing to hit that 40-day mark. But we'll see. Again, I wouldn't be surprised with how God likes to be poetic and orderly and well planned things are. Now, that's not to say that Pope Francis was somehow some great, unique, perfect pope, that he gets that, precise, poetic send-off that perfectly mirrors, the resurrection of Christ in the time before his ascension. But I do think it's interesting to look at the poetic timing of Francis's death. I think it does say a bit more about how God and Christ view Pope Francis, as opposed to how he's viewed by a lot of the lay people and non-Catholics around the world. Another thing to that point that Lesser Josh had to remind me of was when Pope Francis was in the hospital, there was a rainbow over the hospital where Francis was staying at one point. And as we know, rainbows are a sign of God's mercy and blessing. So I think we can assume that, for all intents and purposes, Pope Francis was fairly within God's favor, as we saw at the end of his life. Now, obviously, that's not to say everything Pope Francis did was good, everything he said was good, perfect. No man is perfect. Everyone is a sinner. But a lot of the negative aspects of Pope Francis get either blown out of proportion or outright lies by either atheists or non-Catholics or even Catholics. They all have their own reasons for twisting or misrepresenting or straight up lying about just what Francis said and did in his time as the Holy Father. And I know I said I was going to try to avoid being combative, but I do want to be, I guess, at least defensive of Pope Francis's legacy a bit, because he was so wrongfully attacked throughout his papacy. And not always necessarily without warrant. Like I said, he's not perfect, but there were a lot of lies about him as Pope. You had the media, various outlets, just misrepresenting things he said for whatever purposes. You had people who were atheists pointing to supposed things that Francis said to try to justify their beliefs or their ideas, which is interesting that an atheist would be so quick to try to get the Pope, or try to make the Pope's words seem supportive of them, even though they don't believe in Christ or the church. But I think it might say something to the point of, maybe not a conscious recognition, but like a subconscious understanding of the authority of the church and the Pope. They're so keen on trying to make the Pope seem aligned with them. And in some way they know that the church is the Church of Christ, and the Pope is the vicar of Christ on earth, and that it's important to have him, be on the side of whatever issue you care about. I think there is something a bit to that, and something to consider when looking back at a lot. Then you also have non-Catholic Christians who I saw a lot of were just using the lies about what Francis would say to attack the church and attack Rome. There was the whole thing where the Pope said that people in gay relationships can be blessed. And I saw so many Protestants freaking out saying that the Pope was saying gay marriage can be blessed, and that the Pope's endorsing gay marriage, which is an outright lie. It's two totally different things. And I'm sure some people were misled, but some people were just outright, maliciously dishonest with it for whatever reasons they had to try to discount the Pope and his authority. But it wasn't a claim that, he's backing gay marriage, or says that gay marriages can be blessed. Sin cannot be blessed, but sinners can. That's where the difference is, and that's what Pope Francis was saying. That even though you are a sinner by being in a gay relationship, you can still receive blessing, just like anyone who is a sinner can be blessed. That doesn't mean that he agrees with it, but he's not going to turn away someone for being a sinner. That is like the exact opposite of Christ and what someone who is acting in the person of Christ would be doing. But I'm not going to pursue that path because it gets more combative, and I want to be a bit more honorable of Francis and the episode about remembering and kind of defending him. But I also saw a lot of Catholics who were angry with him for his political stances, and granted, there was a lot of his politics I certainly didn't like. There's a lot of politics of most of the popes I don't like. But it's important to remember that the Pope is a spiritual leader, not a political leader. And popes are people too. They're allowed to have their own private political beliefs outside of their role as a spiritual leader. And I feel like a lot of people have trouble separating those two parts. You know, the Pope as Pope and the Pope as a person. Now, did he speak from his position as Pope? Yeah, because what's he going to do? Just shut down all his personal beliefs during his papacy, which in theory can last decades. I mean, it lasted 12 years. That's the rest of his life. Unless you're Benedict. But just because he has a political position you disagree with doesn't mean he's not still a good spiritual leader. The two realms are separate. And as far as his spiritual leadership, Pope Francis was still very good. He still stood by, the traditional teachings of the church. He frequently defended the sanctity of the unborn, the traditional definition of marriage between one man and one woman, despite what lies would have you believe. Still stood firm against, female members of the clergy. Was he perfect? No, of course not. But no one short of Christ is. And you can say what you want about papal infallibility, but very important quick lesson on papal infallibility. Papal infallibility only exists when the Pope speaks ex cathedra, or from the chair, in which he is speaking on a matter of such, gravity, importance, whatever word you want to use, that it is assumed that the Holy Spirit kind of not takes over, but comes on to the Pope and speaks through him in a way. And for all the things you want to say about papal infallibility, throughout the history of the church, papal infallibility, speaking ex cathedra, has only happened twice. And those two are the Immaculate Conception and the Assumption of Mary. Those are the only two times. Have your problems with, Catholic teaching on Mary, but it's not saying that every time the Pope speaks that what he's saying is infallible, or that Catholics have to agree with it or believe it. No. It's only happened twice in the entire history of the Catholic Church that papal infallibility has been exercised. And you can see it with a lot of people talking about the Pope when they bring up, there's papal infallibility. But you need to understand how rare it is and just what it means. We don't owe undying loyalty to every word the Pope speaks. So if the Pope voices political opinions, he's not infallible there. But one thing I tend to notice when people try to criticize Pope Francis for certain political positions is these people tend to have some truly abhorrent political positions themselves. People who are okay with blowing up the Three Gorges Dam and drowning millions of innocent Chinese civilians, or indiscriminate bombing of Islamic countries because you don't like the government there or a certain group there. And who cares if the civilians die because they're brown and that's okay. But yet what Pope Francis says politically is just evil and gotta be set Adventist or whatever. And a lot of it is just a lot of the attacks on Pope Francis during his papacy were evident of either maliciousness or people being misled by Satan trying to attack the authority of Rome, the church established by Christ, and just the attempt to disparage the positive aspects of Pope Francis and his role as a spiritual leader of the largest religion in the world, the true religion of the world. One thing I see a lot of people when they see people online attacking Christianity, they always say, why do you never see those people attacking Islam or Judaism or Hinduism, Buddhism, whatever? It's because while the people themselves may not be motivated by Satan, the attacks are. And so why would you attack a false religion? Of course they're only going to attack the true religion. And it's why the church is constantly assailed by vicious attacks and lies and misrepresentations. And you can see it very clearly in the papacy of Pope Francis, that there are constant attempts to weaken Christ's church on earth. But now Pope Francis has sadly passed away. I urge everyone to pray for his soul and pray for the cardinals to elect a good pope in the coming days or weeks. And just think about what I said at the start with the poetic nature of Francis's death, of dying just after the celebration of Christ's resurrection. And Christ relieving his vicar of duty right after he rises from the dead and is holding down the reins a bit, letting Francis have his rest. And I pray that Pope Francis will find peace and be able to spend eternity with Christ. And I pray that all those who made such intentionally malicious lies about Pope Francis will repent, come to Christ, and that Pope Francis will get to greet them all as brothers in heaven, and that Satan will lose all those souls to Christ in the end. So, rest in peace, Pope Francis, a man who devoted his entire life to Christ, something that we can only hope to achieve a fraction of. Yeah, I wanted to get into that actually a lot more. Not a lot more, but just Pope Francis being a servant of Christ and of the church his entire life, obviously. He entered, started in his service in the clergy, or started his path towards the clergy when he was 21. And he made it to 88. So he spent 67 years with his life completely dedicated to the church. I feel like not many people who want to criticize him have that even close to a resume like that. And even with his decades of service and being the Pope, Francis always acted with, humility and grace and service. And despite being the head of the church, he still was able to humble himself before God. And the people who just want to spread lies about him online can't even come close to his lifetime of service to Christ. It's a little food for thought. I want to make sure to get that in there. It's not to say that, just because you're a clergyman, you're automatically better than a layman, but there is certainly something to be said about nearly 7 decades of service to Christ in his church. The people who criticize him might want to think about. Okay, after that false ending that was coming earlier, I think this is the real ending. I hope my voice seemed bad to me. Hope it didn't come across so bad, but well, we'll see. Anyway, rest in peace, Pope Francis. Hope I can see you in heaven someday.